that's night. Now, the interesting thing about these teachings is not only do these represent a daily cycle of 5 stages of the sun, but also represent stages of consciousness in our development and also time periods in history. So that's how these cycles work. And this is why we're talking about continual cycles. In these man's teachings, there is no beginning and there is no end. They don't believe in a Big Bang theory. All they do is talk about cycles in between. There's no time, there's no beginning, there's no end. So Kheper represents a time frame that may go back as much as 65,000 years ago. Ra, again, as a true indigenous teacher, Hakim doesn't deal in exact dates. He's not interested in quantifying like we are in the modern world with our predominance of left brain thinking. He's more interested in quality than quantity. So these are only approximations. Perhaps 65,000 years ago, perhaps 50,000 years ago, perhaps 30,000 years ago, perhaps 20,000 years ago. And Amen, we can be more specific, which is about 5,000 years ago. Now, also stages of consciousness. This is the birth of consciousness, where we are reborn, to begin the path of consciousness. Ra, why it's called the stubborn, it represents an adolescent stage of consciousness, and we all know, all of your parents, remember when we were teenagers, we think we know everything. And we tend to be a little stubborn as far as learning something new. So that's like the adolescent stages of consciousness. Un is mature consciousness. When we've gained a little wisdom, we've become wise. And Aten represents the height of consciousness. The sun at its full flowering in the afternoon. We're at the full stage of consciousness. We're hard for people to believe, but in the stage of Aten, we're all enlightened. And Amen represents the fall. And every myth, Acharya talked this morning about the links of all mythologies around the world. Every mythology talks about a fall from the golden age, a fall from grace. Amen represents that. We're going into darkness, hidden. Everything is night, darkness. And folks, that's where we are now. Here's a different aspect of this teaching. We are in the darkest stage of these 5 cycles for the last 5,000 years. Even with I always like to use the expression John Anthony West uses, and it's a great quote. We think we're so evolved today with our striped toothpaste and our hydrogen bombs. That dates us because teenagers don't know what striped toothpaste is anymore, going back to the 60s. But we're actually in the lowest stage of consciousness, and we're coming out. And the reason for these teachings, the reason we're bringing this out, the reason why he has been given permission to bring these teachings to the West, through me and others, I'm not the only one, is that we're coming to a new stage of Kheper now. Just like the Mayan calendar, just like you hear from Native American elders, we just did a great Star Knowledge conference in Minnesota where we presented these teachings to Native Americans, and they just ate it up. It was so much in line with their own traditions, their own teachings. We're coming out of this now. And here's another teaching I'd like to give you. Without offending anybody's religious tendencies here. Amen, Amen, Omein in Hebrew, which we all say in Christianity and in Judaism and in Islam in its way, at the end of prayers, we are taught to believe means, so let it be done. Thy will be done, so let it be. Well, actually it means, according to the Commission teachings, so let it be hidden. So let it be in darkness. Think about that. So this forms a framework for what we're going to talk about. And one last thing I have to give you, because it's essential for my presentation and for Christopher's, is another. 5 is a key number. And I'm bringing it up in his current book, too. 5 is a number that the Commissions use over and over, along with the number 42. 42, why? They tell us 42 was the original number of tribes that made up ancient Kemet. And as was discussed this morning, in everybody's presentations here, it's great how we dovetail together. Hakim's prejudice, his bias, as an Afrocentrist, is that we all came from Africa. That it all came from Africa. Africa was the beginning of humanity and the civilization. So the 42 tribes we're talking about that made up ancient Kemet were all races, all types of people, including the Caucasian race. We're taught that we, Caucasians, came from the Caucasus Mountains in the steppes of Russia. Well, according to this tradition, the white race came from Africa, too. So we all came from Africa. So this ancient civilization, which was known as the Sesh, S-E-S-H, the word for the people, it was 42 tribes. And if I had time to show you all this continues all through Egyptian iconography. You see 42 assessors of Osiris. There were 42 steps that led to every temple. There's 42 this, 42 that. That number comes up and up again. So does the number 5. So 5 purs. And pur again meant house. So the first one is key. Per-ah, which means the high house. And here's a teaching to blow everything away you've ever learned about Egypt. The word Pharaoh. Pharaoh. Every day you can go on, see Zahiwas or somebody on National Geographic talking about the pharaohs, the land of the pharaohs, the pharaoh Ramses, the pharaohs Thutmose. Everybody using the word wrong, including myself for many years, using the word wrong. Per-ah is where the word pharaoh comes from. In Hebrew, it's per-o. Because the Greeks and the Jews later, patriarchal society, looked at the society of ancient Egypt and they saw kings and sons. So they said, oh, per-ah must be the king's house. Well, it's not. The high house is the woman's house. You're talking about a civilization that was a matriarchy, where descent was matrilineal. Descent went from mother to daughter. So I say to you unequivocally, there never was a male pharaoh. Ever. Ever. The woman was the per-ah, who she chose to be her consort, could have the right to be king. But it was her house. Men in Egypt were only residents in their consort's house. Think about that, folks. Think about that, men. And this, I mean, I could go on and on. There's a lot of books on this subject. If you want more information about the matriarchal, there's a lot of people who have written about it. So that's number one. Pharaoh, throw it out. It doesn't mean male king. Second, per-ka. We had that word ka again. This is your tomb. Per-ka, the house of the physical projection, the personality, which they believe was attached to the body. So that's where the body was laid. Simple enough. That became the tomb. Third, per-ba. Some of you may have seen the word ba. Ba has been translated as soul. I prefer the word spirit. The house of the spirit. That's your temple. That's where people would go to raise consciousness, to do chanting, all sorts of different techniques and exercises to raise your level, consciousness to a higher level, to be aware of spirit, to be aware that you're more than the body. So that was where the temple came from. Third, and fourth most important for mine and the next presenter, per-neter. And neter is a key word here. That's your pyramid. The house of the neter. What does neter mean? Well, good old Champollion, Frenchman who worked 21 years to decipher hieroglyphics from 1799 to 1821, 22 years actually, thought he was able to translate the symbols of Egyptian, what we call hieroglyphs, which is a Greek word. And that's led to the whole field of Egyptology. Well, the fact of the matter is the Greeks couldn't read the symbols correctly. And I can go into a lot of detail, but that we don't have time. So all of Champollion's translations are basically incorrect. All of Egyptology's translations are basically incorrect. So the word neter, they translate as god or goddess. Somebody asked earlier, what about all the gods and goddesses of Egypt? Well, the mere fact is we're looking at two different levels of understanding, which I'm going to discuss in great detail in this second book, that there was an exoteric teaching and an esoteric teaching. The exoteric maybe is talking about gods and goddesses, but the true meaning of neter is not god or goddess. And first one, again, who did this in modern times was R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was the first one to look at this word and said, wait a minute, this word doesn't mean deity like we understand. It means an aspect or principle of the divine. Part of the whole, not the whole. So neter is actually where the Greek word nature comes from. Neter, nature. So the house of nature, the house of energy. Pyramid, Greek word pyramidos, fire in the middle. Much closer to the true understanding. Had nothing to do with tomb. So of course at this point we always stop and say, in its original inception, in its original creation, no one was to be ever buried in a pyramid. Per-ka is your tomb. This is not tombs. So this throws out 90% of Egyptology right here. They're talking about pyramids and kings being buried in pyramids. Nonsense. And Christopher will greatly elaborate on this and show you unequivocally how this was a machine, the Great Pyramid, not a temple. And it fits right in the concept of per-neter. So we provide the cultural framework for Christopher's work. House of energy, house of nature. And he will go into detail about how. Now, when I first presented this, and this is in my first book, The Land of Osiris, which is still available, and this is it in Russian. If anybody speaks Russian, we have a Russian copy. I can't read a word of it, but we have it from a Ukrainian press in Russian now. I presented these four. When we were on tour together in 1999, Hakim was talking to our group, and he's going, okay, and there's 5 pers. And he went per-ah, per-ka, per-ba, per-neter. And he's going, ah, ah. And then he goes like this when he can't think, ah. Where's the 5th one? And he looks at me, and I said, Papa, you never told me the 5th one. I don't know. Maybe it's the secret one. Well, you're going to see it in the slides. We found it in 1999. And that's the 5th one, because everything